All right. Good afternoon, morning if you're on the West Coast. My name is Erin Burns from the Connect and Communicate Series Planning Committee. Thank you for joining us today for the Feminist Reference Desk panel discussion. We are recording this session and it will be made available to PALA members through the CRD website, and the PALA website will provide a link on the CRD blog site as well. For the discussion, you really only need a headset or speakers. We encourage you to ask questions in this chat box throughout the discussion. We can attempt to include your questions when appropriate during the discussion or at the end. That may be more up to our speakers at that point. We'll also do our best to assist participants with other technical issues, so feel free to put those into the chat box as well. The Feminist Reference Desk panel is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Library Association College and Research Division, CRD, and the Connect and Communicate series. We'd like to thank the CRD board for supporting the Connect and Communicate initiative and other Connect and Communicate planning members, including Sarah Pike, Jill Hallam Miller, Amy Snyder, Amanda Avery, Ryan Sittler, Ronali Chioco, and Diane Porterfield, who is doing our closed captioning for today. If you are just joining us, feel free to type into the chat box, say hello. If there are more than one of you in the room watching, please also type that into the chat box. We like to keep track of our attendance. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending today and thank our panelists for today's session, and I will introduce them. Maura Seal is the history librarian at the University of Michigan and was previously a collections research and instruction librarian at Georgetown University. Celia Emmelhainz is the anthropology and qualitative research librarian at the University of California in Berkeley. She's led other workshops internationally on ethnographic assessment in libraries and publishes on critical librarianship and on qualitative research studies in academic libraries. Erin Pappas is the research librarian for the humanities at the University of Virginia. She has presented and written on international digital libraries and DH projects, early career mentoring, and occasionally conducts improv workshops for librarians. Nina Clements is the librarian and information literacy coordinator at California State University, Channel Islands, and she is interested in information literacy as well as the intersection of the arts and librarianship. All of their Twitter handles are available online at the PALA website. And I will stop sharing my screen so that Maura can take over.
Woohoo! Good times. Well, actually, sorry. Okay, let me hit present here. Can we see our slides?
We can. I can see them. Yay. Hopefully everyone else can. Okay, great. So thank you all so much for having us. This is Erin talking now. I just wanted to say thank you for hosting us. Thank you to my co-presenters. And it's great to see people from, all over the country and some people even from Canada and other countries as well. So super awesome. Glad to have you. Our main focus for today is actually to be able to talk a little bit to you and to each other. So we're going to give a fairly briefish overview of our chapter. Celia and Maura are going to focus more on the methods piece, and I'm just going to do kind of the introduction of what we were set out to study, why it happened, what we were interested in finding. So just to get started, those of us who perform public service talk about it, right? That can be in back channels online, chat windows, other kinds of things, or in Twitter, or commiserating at someone's desk or in the break room. So this chapter actually kind of was born out of conversations that the three of us were having in precisely those ways. So not to name names, but to give a few examples, there was the patron who asked if the librarian was pregnant. She was not, or the one who loudly critiqued the librarian's typing skills in front of a bunch of undergraduates. It's fairly well established, I think, too, that there are certain types that a reference librarian might encounter during her shift. So those range from the aggressive patron to someone who's crying, to someone who's a know-it-all, to someone who's overly familiar or touchy-feely, to outright harassing. So as we were talking and sharing, we noticed a common theme emerging out of our different experiences, namely that we were being asked in subtle and not so subtle ways by supervisors, by colleagues, the best practices documents from our professional organizations, and in some cases, the behavior of patrons themselves to do a whole lot more than find the best information for the individuals who came up to the desk. So this was like a lot more than just information queries, right? Maura, can you, next slide. So the best practices, thank you, you already knew. The best practices documents that we're talking about are the Reference and User Services Association guidelines from the RUSA website, which are linked down below. These are, quote, authoritative documents offering suggested levels of performance or adequacy that outline a recommended course of action. So unlike standards that carry the weight of a rule, guidelines describe measures to help libraries meet the requirements of a standard. So they're not enforceable, I guess, in the same way that a standard is. Now, these exist on a variety of topics. There's like a dozen of them, from genealogy to patron services, collection development. For our chapter, we focus specifically on reference and information services, specifically the guidelines for the behavioral performance of reference and information service providers, which sounds a little menacing, right? These were first published in 1996, revised again in 2004, and again in 2013. So in this first slide, what we have here is basically some work that had already been done on emotional labor as it related to the service professions more broadly, and looking at where it existed as part of librarianship. So this first quote is from Arlie Hochschild. Her book, The Managed Heart from 1983, was one of the first uses of the term in relation to a study of flight attendants. And I guess I can read this quote in a really, I feel like I can't even read it in a non-goofy way, but like, you know, girls, I want you to go out there and really smile. Your smile is your biggest asset. I want you to go out there and use it. Smile, really lay it on. And that those italics are actually in the original kind of, I guess, to connote the emphasis there, right? So when we talk about that, what she's talking about is a term that she's deemed emotional labor. And emotional labor is different from emotion work or something that's done in a private context, right? Labor is always done in this compensated work environment. And emotional labor, quote, requires one to induce or suppress feeling in order to sustain the outward countenance that produces the proper state of mind in others. In this case, the sense of being cared for in a convivial and safe place. This kind of labor calls for a coordination of mind and feeling, and it sometimes draws on a source of self that we honor as deep and integral to our individuality. So, and then you can also see, right, the RUSA guideline, one of the kind of guiding principles. While not every query will be of interest to the librarian should embrace each patron's informational need and should be committed to providing the most effective assistance. Librarians who demonstrate a high level of interest in the inquiries of patrons will generate a higher level of satisfaction among users. So already, just even superficially, you can kind of see some similarities to the Hochschild. So Maura and Celia will explain this in more depth. Maura, do you want to go next slide? But we set out to explore a couple of things. What the guidelines codify with regard to emotional labor, where do they locate agency? Is that with the librarian? Is that with the patron? Is that with both? So working from our own positions as women, as feminists, and as I have written here, usually proud service workers, we also wanted to think about the ways that something that's called an ethics of care that Maria Accardi and other people have talked about extensively could maybe help mitigate some of the gendered, possibly damaging, and nearly always exhausting performance of emotional labor, right? Especially when these are expected to be internalized or to come from an authentic place. So there's a strong tension that we find between patron-centered librarianship, which we all believe in, and meaningful professional autonomy. So we're saying, like, we're constantly erasing ourselves. How can we be seen? And if the impulse for us is to make meaningful human connections, emotional labor asks us to put the other person first, to subsume ourselves into anticipating to and responding to their needs. Whereas an ethics of care focuses on the relatedness of persons rather than on people as fundamentally autonomous individuals. So it asks us to see people as whole, to understand that no person comes to an interaction devoid of history, agency, positionality, or a sense of self. And I think this is particularly important when we're talking about something like the reference encounter, or, you know, Maria Accardi uses it with reference to library instruction, right? Where it's about guiding people to a place of learning co-knowledge, learning together, co-creation, rather than treating the patron and librarian relationship like a service encounter where the patron is and you can sort of see me using scare quotes, I hear a customer, right, who has to be satisfied, appeased, and coddled above all else. One thing that we want to talk about more broadly, I think, in the discussion is just how can we square the practice of an ethics of care with the gendered expectation of emotional labor. And Maura will take it from here and talk a little bit about our methods and close reading, and then Celia will talk about the sort of nitty-gritty of qualitative content analysis.
Sure. Okay, so this is just a link to the Arisa Guidelines if you would like to have a look at them. I'm not going to sort of go into all of them. It's a lengthy document. So when assessing these, we took a look at, we did a close reading of the guidelines, which is what I'll talk about, and Celia will talk about a qualitative analysis that we also did. So to sum up the close reading, Arisa Guidelines codify emotional labor in the reference interaction. They locate the success of the interaction in librarians' performance of emotional labor rather than meeting informational needs. So the success is about making the patron feel good rather than helping them find what they need in terms of information. So the Arisa Guidelines focus not on the procedure of reference, but on the behavior of librarian. They're not about what to do at the desk or in any sort of reference interaction, but how to be in the moment of that interaction. The behavior of the librarian leads to the success or failure, and there's constant emphasis on attending to the emotional state of the patron. One of these things is like by providing a greeting and being friendly, and all of this is spelled out in very explicit detail. And I have to share this anecdote from a colleague of mine. We're roughly contemporary, she's maybe a few years older than me, but she's talked about how in library school in their reference class, they practiced nodding, nodding at patrons. in a way to indicate interest and openness and availability. So the fact, this is how reference is being taught in some places. It wasn't in my library school, but yeah. So, and just the nodding, it's crazy, right? Nodding. Yeah. Okay. And also, as the sort of quote that we opened with indicates, by performing interest in the interaction. So the librarian is supposed to be interested in the interaction, even if you think it's a dumb question or a bad question or a question that can't be answered. You're supposed to be interested and express that interest. So again, so the patron feels good. And finally, the librarian has to suppress her own emotions and assume neutrality. So when you have that patron who asks if you're pregnant, that was me. No, I was not. And it felt sort of crappy, but you have to sort of tamp it down and just move forward. So the Arisa Guidelines, the goal is not to answer the question well, but to make the patron feel good. The successful search is not the one that produces an accurate or meaningful or helpful results, but the one that induces positive feelings. And so what we ask in this chapter is, if librarian behavior is the sole factor in the success of the interaction, where does that leave the patron and their behavior? As Erin somewhat alluded to, interaction happens between people, but within the guidelines, the patron has no real responsibility to behave or not be a jerk or basically anything like that. The patron's role instead is to perceive and feel only, and the librarian's role is to provide the right feeling and the right presence to the patron. Interactions occur within multiple intersectional contexts, but the guidelines really very much rely on a neutral interaction and a neutral space outside of social contexts. So the Arisa Guidelines are pervaded by gendered language and ideas, and there's a tension between asserting authority as librarians and then the guidelines de-emphasizing that so patrons can feel smart. So at the end of the successful reference interaction, patrons are supposed to feel like they've done this all themselves, kind of. Yeah. The guidelines really they over-articulate what librarians should do. Like, there's no sense that maybe we know because we do this work and we're, we have training in this work and we're thoughtful and smart people and know how to do things. Yeah, and again, like, the real purpose of the reference interaction is brushed aside in favor of fulfilling the needs of others via the performance of gendered emotional labor. So. And now Celia will talk about qualitative content analysis.
Okay. So we kind of did these two methods in tandem. On the one hand, we did a close reading, which you really could call qualitative analysis as well, just depending on what field you're in. But I chose this method. Actually, go ahead and flip to the next slide.
The next one?
Yes. So you can kind of see what I was doing here. We had a spreadsheet, we pulled the actual text from the guidelines, and we started looking for themes that were just repeating. And then we coded each segment, each specific guideline, as to whether that theme was there or not. And so the themes here are approachable, visible, affirm, comfort, encourage, working on their timing, focusing on them, showing friendly, sort of embodied labor that were physically present and physically interested, and a service orientation. And so this was a way for us not just to pick the quotes, which if you look at the chapter, you'll see we picked quotes that really stood out to us about being cordial and friendly and ready to please. But we wanted to kind of step back and take a broader look and code for these themes. And if you go to the next slide. So this was our results, and it's actually a little bit qualitative. It's ironic that it's called quantitative. It's ironic that it's called qualitative content analysis, but I was borrowing that term from Beth Dupuy and Jeff Liu here at UC Berkeley, and they had done what I would call a qualitative analysis, looking for emergent themes and some work here, and they had published. So we were kind of borrowing their method. But what you see here is that over 70% of the guidelines that were listed met some aspect of emotional labor, and we labeled them here. And we kind of used this to talk about, okay, these are the different aspects of emotional labor that we're specifically being asked to display as librarians. And that was the context for our close reading and for our discussion of, what does it mean to be asked to perform emotional labor as professionals? How do we do this in a good way, but how do we ensure that this is a dialogue and a collaboration with the patron and not just us being kind of a customer service provider alone? And we wanted to move, I think, from here to questions. Erin, how long would we have for?
Other Erin.
Okay, other Erin chiming in. We can either discuss this now with these discussions, or we can let Nina go into her discussion.
I'd be happy to do it either way.
And then come back to these. Nina, how do you feel?
I'm happy to go either way. I have a slide that just asks for audience questions at the end.
Okay.
So whatever you want to do is fine with me.
Let's just combine them. I think that they certainly speak to each other, and especially that idea of like the desk as a neutral site, and so we'll hang on to these.
Sure. All right, so let me see if I can share my screen. I cannot.
Oh, I just stopped sharing, so you should be able to now.
Let's see if this allows me to do it. Okay, is that working? Hold on one second, let's see. Share screen.
Yep. There you go.
Awesome, this is great. Okay, well, hi everybody. I want to thank Erin for inviting me to present, and I'm so excited to be presenting with Erin, Celia, and Maura because our chapters are right next to each other in the Feminist Reference Desk, and it's exciting to actually put them in literal conversation instead of just sort of adjacency. So I'm really excited, especially for the questions that I hope will come at the end. So my chapter is called Nothing More Than a Gear in Your Car, Neutrality and Feminist Reference in the Academic Library. And basically, this began as, this is an essay, so it's not a study, it's a little bit different than the chapter before mine. But it began as a guest blog post called Neutrality Burns back in June 2015 on Maria Accardi's blog, Librarian Burnout, and kind of grew into more of an expansive essay on the question of neutrality. So this is going to be, I apologize, a text-heavy presentation, but I also look at, not surprisingly, the Arisa Guidelines and some other texts. And the quote, "Nothing more than a gear in your car," comes from Chris Borg in one of her blog posts. Okay, so let's see if I can advance. Yes, so I'm going to give you basically an overview of my chapter, which is broken down into several parts with some definitions of feminism, my idea that feminism and neutrality are really diametrically opposed and incompatible. I'm going to talk about neutrality in the LIS profession along with authenticity as an aspect of feminism, and then the Feminist Reference Desk in our non-neutral world. And I'm hoping to hear from all of you in terms of what your Feminist Reference Desk looks like in the non-neutral world. Okay, so some really quick and dirty definitions of feminisms, because there's not really one, as we all know. So I'm always going back to bell hooks. Feminism is the struggle to end sexist oppression. And then Maria Accardi's definition from Feminist Pedagogy for Library Instruction, I think, is really expansive and not surprisingly relevant to our talk about feminist reference. Feminism is about, among other things, decentering oppressive power relations and transforming them into something egalitarian and democratic. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to do some of this decentering work in the reference interview itself. So I think there's a lot of work that we could be doing. So neutrality. I have some definitions here from my favorite reference source, the Oxford English Dictionary. And the first definition is actually that it's an intermediate state or condition, not clearly one thing or another. So I kind of liken that in my chapter to having a bad cold. And then another definition is that it's the abstention from taking any part in a war between other states. And then the part that I think we often think of in libraries is that it is the state or condition of not being on any side, an absence of decided views, feeling, or expression, indifference, impartiality, dispassionateness. And this is something that we really talked about in my reference class and almost every class really at library school. And I posit that neutrality, as we understand it and practice it, is incompatible with feminisms, which are all about ending oppression and decentering power. So you cannot be neutral and do this work. Alison Lewis, in Questioning Library Neutrality, which was published in 2008 from Library Jews Press, really hits on the indifference aspect, that neutrality looks like, from the patron's perspective, from faculty and students, in my case, since I work in an academic library, it looks like indifference. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we go on. So the word neutral does not appear in the Arisa Guidelines for behavioral performance of reference and information service providers. And I really love everything that Maura, Celia, and Erin had to say about these guidelines. And the guidelines do state, however, that the librarian must be in compliance with institutional and professional norms and policies. So the librarian must comply with unspecified norms and policies to maintain the status quo. That's the subtext, maintaining the status quo, which is just another way, I argue, of reproducing oppressive power structures and reinforcing the dominant ideology of a particular library or particular campus, a particular country, as the case may be. So what does neutrality in the LIS profession look like? So I argue that it prevents us from sharing our feelings and opinions in the reference interaction. We are not supposed to have any of those. And I think we're sort of giving our patrons short shrift by pretending to be robots. The reference interview is an opportunity to inspire students to think critically of the world around them, which is yet another way of practicing feminism and decentering oppressive power. It's a teachable moment. We're supposed to be helping our students to open up. And I don't think there's a chance for that kind of opening in a neutral reference interview. And especially, this is what neutrality really means and is very dangerous just at this political moment, that we reject any political stance. I think that's a really dangerous position to be in right now. Okay, so some other thoughts from questioning library neutrality. I swear I read other things, but this particular book was really compelling. So librarianship's reluctance to define its value in political terms and to cultivate a sense of social responsibility may allow it to drift into an uncritical accommodation with society's dominant political and economic powers. Yeah, that's really powerful stuff. And I think something that we did not cover at all in my MLIS program is that librarianship's history is not so neutral, that the very emergence of the library profession was intimately associated with ideologically informed efforts to place the whole development of education and mass enlightenment under the aegis of elite business interests. So robber barons, Carnegie libraries. I think, this is not something that we covered in my MLIS program. And has given me a lot of thought. So I think the profession seems to have taken a turn towards social justice. It's everywhere at conferences, but how can we focus on social justice in an unjust world from a neutral perspective? This is my question. And neutrality is a means of neutralizing professionals. So it's sort of that tension that y'all were talking about in your chapter between patron-centered services and professional autonomy. If we are neutralized, what kind of autonomy do we have? And then Chris Borg says that libraries are not now, or have they ever been, merely neutral repositories of information, and nor are reference librarians neutral mouthpieces for that information. It's not possible. Okay, so objectivity is the word that does get used in the Arisa Guidelines. The librarian maintains objectivity, does not interject value judgments about the subject matter or the nature of the question into the transaction. So my question here is, how did this capitalist language of transaction get into our guidelines? How did it get into our profession? What is actually being exchanged? The reference interview itself, I like to think of it as a dialectic, a conversation. Furthermore, this suggests that the librarian is apolitical or has no political context or existence outside of this interview, or that the library within which the transaction, scare quotes there, takes place is an apolitical, neutral space. As we know, regardless whether you're in a public library or an academic library, this is just not the case. So in 2015, my campus, my former institution, was sort of besieged by student-led protests about the lack of diversity amongst the student body and the faculty at these institutions. And our library, in response to these protests, which were really quite compelling, we extended our hours, but we did not publicize that we were doing so. Nor did we issue a statement affirming diversity, which many other service providers on the campuses did. And I think this was a real opportunity for us to help students effect change, but we decided to cower behind our neutrality and say nothing. So I think this was a real missed opportunity. I think that we often do nothing because of our neutrality when really we're just afraid of consequences that may not be favorable to us. So in my chapter, I talk a lot about authenticity. which is defined in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as describing a person who acts in accordance with desires, motives, ideals, or beliefs that are not only hers as opposed to someone else's, but that also express who she really is. And I think feminism can be our authentic practice. We have the opportunity to express our authentic feminist selves in the reference interaction, and we should do so. For example, I had a question when I was working at the reference desk about renting books. And so I talked a lot to these students about, how that's sort of more of a capitalist model, that we borrow books at the library, and what does that mean versus renting? So neutrality, if I had taken a neutral stance, I probably would have just answered the question, but coming from a feminism sort of anti-capitalist or critical of capitalism place, I was able to have more of a conversation, an expansive conversation with those students. And they kind of were asking like, oh yeah, I never, they were really expanding. They shared with me that they'd never been to a public library and didn't understand how borrowing worked. And we wouldn't really have had that conversation if I had just answered the question without digging into it. So the Feminist Reference Desk in a non-neutral world. So ironically, I think the framework for information literacy in higher education helps address some of this, especially with one of their frames, authority is constructed and contextual. So I think we get a lot of really mixed messages in our profession. We have the Arisa Guidelines, and then we have the framework for information literacy. And I think they really get at different competing ideas. So is the reference librarian's authority constructed and contextual as well? I would argue that it is, and that if you come to the reference interview from a place of equality and conversation, that authority can, you can affirm it in a really positive way, or it can dissolve a little bit. I maintain that neutrality is a tacit acceptance of the status quo. I have an interesting example. We were remodeling our library. This is a couple institutions ago. We were remodeling the library, and I showed a mock-up of the remodel to a business professor who was really enthusiastic about it because she liked the way that the new furniture sort of gave a more corporate feel and would help students be more job ready. And I just completely deflated when she said that. I mean, I agreed with her, but I was not so enthusiastic about that. And I think that librarians can work with patrons and students, faculty members, whoever, to create a culture of knowledge and social change, which is sort of the antithesis of a neutral experience. I think that practicing feminisms is one authentic way that librarians can decenter the status quo and promote equality. A possible step is to advocate in some MLIS reference classes and other aspects of programs for a different approach to neutrality. And so, questions?
We can put up that other slide of questions now too.
Okay.
For discussion. But does anybody have anything specific they'd like to talk to Nina about?
Yeah, I'd also love to hear if people have run up against neutrality as a sort of an issue in their libraries and how folks handled it.
I think one area that we've seen it actually is discussions over opening up digitization of materials. And that may not be quite as relevant, but we have a lot of digitized materials from Native American tribes in California. And we've had some library leaders who wanted to make that very value neutral of everything is open access. And we had to go to them and say, no, you can't treat everything the same. These materials, this cultural heritage has a different place. And that was a place where neutrality was in conflict with respecting the needs of a particular group.
Wow, that's a really great example, actually.
Okay, we have a comment. Teresa says that she thinks that neutrality comes up quite often, and the reference interview is a place where we promote not being neutral, right? Being neutral would be taking the question presented and just answering it, whereas properly doing a reference interview is figuring out what the information needs the patron actually has are. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I think, part of doing good reference work is like learning not to take questions at face value, right? And like that's a skill, and it takes time to learn, but it also usually takes like getting to know that person a little bit more. Like, why are you asking the thing that you're asking, and like what precisely is it that you think you need as opposed to what you need? And that's not something, that's not just like, can you tell me how many people of Italian American heritage lived in this neighborhood in 1945? Like, that's like presented as a very straightforward information need. Like, that's what your reference textbooks probably teach you, right? Like, these are the kinds of questions people ask. People very rarely ask those kinds of questions. People come with like diffuse collections of like ideas or thoughts or something they read somewhere. And so that whole process of like drawing out the other person and figuring out what it is that you can help them find or what it is that you can answer together is a really different process. And I think there's like very little way to be neutral, again, like scare quotes everywhere, right? During that kind of conversation. Like you can't just back channel and be like, tell me more. Okay, how do you feel about that? Like you have to do. No, I mean, it's just, I think of like, I'm looking at even the guidelines and they're like, how is your search going? And I'm like, okay, you ask someone how their search is going. If they say it's going badly, like there's an intervention to be had there. You don't just say like, well, sorry about that. Like the good reference work is about reaccommodating, I guess. So.
Right. And nodding is not going to cut it,
No matter how much you practice.
Right. Well, it's just thinking about like nodding or saying like polite back channeling, like when someone's like framing their question. I mean, I get the impulse behind like showing engagement, showing interest, but like that's not answering the need. Like nodding isn't, managing emotional. Yeah. Oh, Colleen. Oh, Colleen.
All right, to read the question, I'd love it if at some point we might discuss approaches for managing emotional labor with either self-care, time away from the desk, strategies for when to step away from the desk within the context of training LIS student workers.
Well, so that actually, I think training LIS student workers really gets at this concept of authority and professionalism that many folks in LIS really guard very territorially. So, for example, here at my library, we will never have someone alone at the reference desk who does not have an MLIS. And that's an accomplished fact. There's nothing I can do about that. So it does raise, your question, I know that's not the focus of your question, but it raises interesting questions about professionalism.
I think in terms of like strategies around self-care, like I think other people have probably written better things about that. But I guess I would say like one thing I always think that has to happen sort of institutionally is we have to recognize that this is work that we do and it's exhausting work and it's often work that's not valued. Like I know at my previous institution, like reference didn't matter. We sat on the desk for like 3 to 4 hours a week, but that's not a thing that was like recognized in your, annual review. Like that wasn't important. And I mean, emotional labor too is like a key component of doing research consultations. Like managing student emotions in instruction. Like this is, so I think that's kind of like a first step, and then that sort of makes space for institutional approaches to self-care and managing emotional labor, I guess.
So I think one of the people to look at is Marian Madison at Kent State University. She was somebody we drew on pretty heavily who's done a lot of research on emotional labor in libraries. And including in things like the relationship between employees and your boss, because you're often also managing up not just managing outwards. And to pull on, Gayatri posted, considering librarianship is mostly women, I wonder if the emotional labor aspects came about because we have so many women in the profession. Did we do it to ourselves? I think that's where we brought in the gendered aspect of emotional labor and said, yeah, it's the way we're seen at the desk when we're women is inescapably a part of things. And the fact that we are seen as a gendered female profession probably does put a heavier emotional burden on us than on some other potentially service or advice or counseling points on campus.
Yeah, I think just to pick up on what Celia is saying, you know, it's not like, I really want to get at the point that like, I think all of us, and Nina, I hope I speak for you too, like we feel very strongly about being in a service profession. Like I think all of us think
absolutely
that's like a good thing. And I guess the question is how to like be a service provider, be an information provider, be like a caring whole person who, you know, sits at the desk and wants to be like, yes, let's like engage in this ethics of care and like, who are you as a person and who am I as a person? Like without kind of subsuming your own needs. I think that's the case where like I see a lot of this, and I do think, I don't want to like speak completely like generationally, but I do think like the librarians I came up with and the people who trained me who were like of an older generation were very much about being invisible and about like that was their kind of reward. Like they wanted to kind of do everything in the service of the patron no matter what, right? And they never kind of took, like they didn't model, I guess, good self-care in any way, right? So like something that I think, I don't think like, let's not, you know, blame us because we're all women, but I do think that there are probably generational things, you know, women who came up in the workforce differently, who came up in this, you know, gendered profession certainly had a different approach, right? So like they're not going to necessarily be the kind of people kicking and screaming and advocating for themselves. I see that very little in my older colleagues. And like that's, you know, I don't know what the intervention is there, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily like we did this to ourselves. I think it just sort of has to do with like where we are like at this historical moment. You know, people who started working in the 70s or the 80s, they probably have a very different attitude about making your own needs explicit. That's like my 2 cents.
Alex, I also wanted to pull your other comment about the Black Lives Matter display. You said that in Texas, trying to hang political things on your office door can be a really contentious issue, and whether discussions at your library about whether you should risk swinging the pendulum to the left in order to remedy past exclusions. And to me, it seems like that is very, very context dependent. I went to grad school in Texas where everything that was even moderate often seemed like a very political issue. And now that I'm at Berkeley, if I didn't speak up, I think I would be completely shamed. So I'm in the opposite context where neutrality is really frowned upon.
She says, I actually loved how you used conflated mommy and emotional labor because I think you perfectly get at the genderedness of it all. I don't know if that was your intention, but it definitely resonated with her. I know it's resonated with me. This is Erin speaking. And likely other female identified librarians. She's just really into your work.
If you haven't seen it, recently in the library with the lead pipe was a great article on actually being a mother in library.
Oh, that was really good. Yeah.
And you really need to go check that out. So
yeah.
And someone else is directing this at Erin Pappas. Super interesting comments on the generational differences in dealing with emotional labor. Do you have either suggestions on further research or reading in this area?
Oof. I'm trying to think if I've read anything recently. I mean, that's more of a like kind of personal observation than something I have seen, and it's just something I think people are kind of talking about. But you know, anything in like, again, lead pipe is such a good place to look.
Well, she posted that in the chat.
Yeah, cool. But I can poke around and see if there's anything else. I would actually love to read more because that's something, again, like Celia said, these things are context dependent, right? Like, so I work at the University of Virginia. Like, we've been in the news a lot for the last few years, right? And I haven't seen this necessarily break down totally by age lines or gender lines, but I do think there's like a certain subset of librarianship that is all about remaining neutral, remaining open, serving the patron no matter what, and then the kind of more, quote unquote radical folks who take the approach that like you can't really be neutral, right, in a situation such as this.
I would actually suggest to go back to the previous comment, Roma Harris's work. She writes a lot about gender and librarianship and sort of how that's played out historically, which I think might get at some of the generational aspects. Like, I saw someone comment on Twitter earlier this week, because there was this sort of ongoing debate about like professionalism and credentials, about like how professionalism had to be fought for too.
Right.
So it's tempting to sort of, and credentials, just to sort of dismiss them both out of hand, but they sort of perform very important work in regards to our own autonomy and ability to act. So.
And then Teresa has another comment. Do you guys have any thoughts on the library leadership being a higher percentage of male?
So many thoughts.
Yes.
Yes. The total librarian population and the impact that it has on our standards.
I know Maura has thoughts. She has more than one.
Arisa Guidelines. I'll add that on too.
Well, I mean, part of that too, right, is that men cluster in like information technology and administration, which are not places where people assume emotional labor happens.
Right. No one expects that about the IT guy.
Yeah.
So I'll put a link in the chat. There's a book I found very interesting called Why So Slow by Virginia Valian, and she looks at how our gender schemas affect who we see as management material, and then specific ways to kind of disentangle those schemas and start thinking of very feminine women, or broadening our idea of what a management would be.
Weirdly, the Harvard Business Review is really good on gender and management.
They've been woke lately,
like totally woke. They had an article, and I've seen it like 100 people post it, but why do so many incompetent men become managers?
It's great.
It is, yeah.
I'll see if I can find it.
All right, Alex wants us to talk a little bit more about how we can begin to acknowledge and value this emotional labor in our workplaces. So are there ways, strategies that you have done, perhaps?
So I'm going to go talk with our new assessment person about this very topic, because I do a lot of research consultations, and like I do, help students find sources, but a lot of that is like therapy, essentially. And I think we need to like keep track of it and acknowledge it and figure out ways to. So that's one strategy I'm pursuing individually, but I think this is connected to management too, right? And leadership. And yeah.
Absolutely.
It's certainly something we saw, I saw when I was putting in my last review, in terms of wanting to submit letters from students who had really been impacted and being told they're not high prestige enough. You need to talk to faculty and get senior faculty to write letters for you. And it was just like, okay, that's not the whole of my focus or mission, and what's going to be reflected in my review is all prestige things. Yeah. So I think the review period is a really crucial period, especially even tenured reviews, to say this is part of our work.
Yeah.
Okay. We do have a comment here about what non-neutrality looks like on the reference desk. Are we talking about maybe patrons? Are we talking them out of researching a particular topic or opinion, or arguing with them as part of the reference process?
So I think possibly neither of those. I think non-neutrality at the reference desk is really being a whole person and approaching whatever information need the patron has from a more authentic, holistic perspective. It could mean sort of disagreeing with them, but explaining why you disagree and sort of helping them kind of deepen their inquiry. I don't think that I think that it's just important that we acknowledge our own opinions and experience when we're answering reference questions.
I think you brought up a really good thing, Jacqueline, because I actually saw this recently with a patron that went to another library and then came to me, and they were very dismayed and upset in this case because they wanted to do research on skin and hair, and specifically ethnic skin and hair, and they had been told that race isn't a thing, that it's a social construct, which is true. But this was a young woman who was not white, who was trying to research skincare products to start her own business, and she had been completely blown off. And so we had to say, whoa, that kind of shifting and trying to be progressive actually wasn't helping this patron. We need to help her on her terms with her needs.
Yeah, and that's definitely the place where like the reference interview is actually the process, right? Like if someone's like, I want to write about hair, or I want to know about hair, being told that's not a real thing. Well, like it kind of is a real thing in the way people purchase stuff, right? It has
right.
There's whole forums on the internet about it. So like, I mean, my thing about being quote unquote non-neutral on the reference desk is like, and it's hard, right? It's hard when like you have a line or you have the phone ringing, but it's like, just wait, because like people will actually tell you what it is they really need, you know, you have to like give it that time. And so, I mean, I've seen this, I hear it, I see it with colleagues who like are so quick to jump on the answer. They're like, oh, I got your answer, here you go, bye, get out of my hair, right? And like that like I don't know, a big part of like that ethics of care is like just letting things unfold. Like it's like a slow like a slow movement. No, but like
it is, yeah.
I noticed this like at conferences when it's like, okay, no, we're gonna wait, right? We're gonna let this moment draw out, and not just jumping on like I have the answer, which is so transactional. To me, that's kind of what it looks like. It doesn't mean like your opinion's wrong, because like you can't, I mean, you know, if that's an opinion, it can't necessarily be wrong. It means more like drawing out the process of like what it is the person truly wants, and then like what we can get to together, rather than being like, I found you your citation, bye, or like I found you a number, leave. Which I mean, I like, I don't know, it's easier to model like what not to do. And I encourage you to like read over your colleagues' chat transcripts, or like to like look at the reference email queue or something like that, and you will see bad reference being done in the guise of, I think, neutrality.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Okay, Celia mentions emotional labor of supervising student workers. Can be significant, and presumably non-student workers. What would it like to be emotional labor more explicit in work plans, job descriptions of supervisors?
I think that's a fabulous question. I think we should all research and write about it a little bit more. We could probably look at what exists as definitions of emotional labor and examples in librarianship, and then codify that into the documents and into the way that supervisors are reviewed. And probably, as Sylvia alludes to, I think there's a time issue here, right? Because you're often doing a full-time liaison job of your own while you're managing. That's really complicated, and it's going to tend to lead you to not want to give the full-time and attention to the student workers that they may need.
Right.
Okay. Do you think neutrality should work differently in public versus academic libraries, and public schools versus private schools, when the money is coming from taxpayers or not, patrons or anyone off the street, or a student there for explicitly educational purposes? Maybe it should all be the same, maybe distinct based on context.
I mean, I think everything is based on context. But I guess I would argue for sort of what Erin was talking about earlier, like with regard to the reference interview or the reference interaction, bringing your whole self to that experience and really kind of trying to dig into what the patron really wants to know, or what the patron really needs to know. I think that can happen irrespective of institution.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to post in the chat an evaluation link, but we can continue this discussion for at least 5 more minutes. Alyssa says she hadn't really looked critically at the RUSA competencies before, and this is very interesting. She was doing some Googling while listening. I'm curious whether the 2017 professional competencies came out of similar critiques. They seem to cover some more professional knowledge, skills, and emotional labor. Are there any thoughts on that?
That's a great question. I probably haven't looked at it because I think it is after our article came out. So now I will be looking at it.
Yeah.
Okay. She posted the link. Great.
Yeah, these are great. And these are actually, right, like they have so much more nuance, I think, even just looking at these, like, you know, expressing interest in individual experience related to information needs is a totally different way of, you know, of not just saying like, you need to nod emphatically to get at someone's reference question. But like, and I think these come out of different sort of subgroups too. Like some of them are more, like this resonates with me actually a lot more because it's like how do you do your job, but then it's also like looking at what applies guidelines for behavioral performance of reference and information service providers is kind of in conflict with some of these other ones, right? Like but to me this is a much stronger document even just looking at it offhand. So if you're training student workers, use this. Don't use it. Or use it, but, you know, kind of talk about it.
Teresa posts, do you have thoughts or know of resources regarding the impact of emotional labor on burnout rates? Great question. I think some of the articles like Marian Madison's may deal with this. I also seem to remember that Maria Accardi had a blog for a while on Librarian Burnout.
Yeah, she did.
Fabulous.
Yeah, I don't know if she did anything with it. I know there was like a lot of guest posts, a lot of people kind of writing about their own experiences. And you could definitely see the kind of through lines, particularly with like the kind of work people did. I mean, I think that's one of the things going back to that, like, where did the men cluster, or, you know, who gets promoted, or what kinds of jobs experience these kinds of heavy emotional labor. Like, they're not people who are in LIT, and they're not even necessarily people like in acquisitions or other technical services. Like, they're the instruction librarian, they're the reference desk person, they're the outreach person. Like, those are the people who this affects disproportionately. So it's not, you know, across the landscape, everyone, not that people don't, you know, all have those kind of same issues. It's still a gendered profession, but.
Yeah, I just wanted to say Maria's blog was really wonderful. And as I mentioned in my presentation, that's where my chapter for this book came out of. But I think there's a lot of work to be done on librarian burnout. I don't think there's enough out there.
There was that recent article about low morale in academic libraries.
Yes, that was really good.
Yeah, I can't remember the title of it, and I'm sharing the screen. So if someone has a link, they should put it in the chat.
It was in, hang on, here we go. It was also about bullying. Oh, that's right.
Oh,
it was in JLA. Yeah.
Okay.
I'll find it. Thank you, Laura. Yeah. This was depressing reading it. Thank you.
She says if you ever start a podcast, she'd listen for sure. Says Kelly. Thank you, Kelly. All right, so I think we can probably stop the discussion, or at least the questions here, because it's almost 2 o'clock here on the East Coast. It is a lot to chew on, Jackie. Thank you, everyone, for attending today. I'd like to give a special shout out again to PALA and the CRD for supporting this conversation. Hopefully we'll be able to continue it either in some of our blog posts and Twitter. Thank you, Celia, Emma, Erin, and Maura, as well as Nina for being here with us today. And with that, I'm going to stop recording. Maybe. There it is. All right, and thank you again.